All right, hello everyone. I encourage you to take your seats for our second panel, please. Well, welcome everyone. For anyone who was not here for the first panel, I'll just reintroduce myself. I'm Pierce Turner. I'm the co-director of the Center for Ethics and Human Values here at Ohio State. And we run a number of different programs meant to encourage ethical discussion and reflection across all kinds of differences and disciplines that people may have, and try to be sort of constructive parts of those conversations and thinking about where we're going from here. So one of our ongoing programs has been COMPAS. It stands for Conversations on Morality, Politics, and Society. And we're really excited to bring together researchers from different disciplines to try to help us think about these large underlying ethical and social questions that really each of these disciplines are taking on just a part of these large questions. And so we're really thrilled to have the speakers with us today that we have. So my job right now is just to introduce the moderator of the second panel, who's my great colleague at the Center for Ethics and Human Values, and also a member of the Department of Computer Science and Engineering over in the College of Engineering, Brian Weaver. Take it away, Brian.
All right, hello. So I'll introduce our second speaker first, and then our first speaker second. So David Deming is the Isabel and Scott Black Professor of Political Economy in the Kennedy School at Harvard University and Professor of Education and Economics in the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He received a Bachelor of Science in Economics and a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from here at LSU in 2002. He received a Master of Public Policy from the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley in 2005, and a PhD in Public Policy from Harvard in 2010. His research interests include higher education, economic inequality, skills, technology, and the future of the labor market. His publications include the growing importance of social skills in the labor market. In 2022, he won the Sherwin-Rosen Prize for outstanding contributions to labor economics, and at Harvard, he's one of the faculty leads of the Project on Workforce, an initiative between the Kennedy School, the Business School, and the Graduate School of Education on the future of work. So our first speaker is going to be Laura Adler. So Dr. Adler is Assistant Professor of Organizational Behavior at the School of Management at Yale, where she is also a courtesy appointment in the Sociology Department. She received a Bachelor of Arts in Humanities from Yale in 2008 and received a Master of City Planning from Berkeley in 2012 and a Master's in Sociology from Harvard in 2017, as well as a PhD in Sociology from Harvard in 2022. Her research interests include organizational theory, economic sociology, culture, gender, pay equity, diversity, and the future of work. Her publications include Gender Equity Against Economic Realities, How a Conflict Between Two Movements Reshaped the Cultural Understanding of Pay. So please help me welcome them.
All right, well, David and Brian have very generously agreed to let me go first, because I am going to be talking about several transformations in work that I find to be very interesting, and then we will shift into more of a focused conversation about how AI is transforming the workplace. So I'm going to give it a second for the slides to come up. I'm Laura Adler. Thank you, Brian, for the kind introduction. I'm an assistant professor of organizational behavior at the Yale School of Management. So I teach MBAs. As a result, I do have slides. You can't teach MBAs without lots of slides. But also, I'm going to be drawing on some of the data that I collect from my MBA students to illustrate some of the key themes that I'll be discussing here. So I'm going to talk quickly about 4 transformations that are affecting the workplace. The first is the employment relationship. So this is about what kind of contract exists between workers and employers. We've already ventured into some territory around gig work, which is part of this conversation. And here, I think we need to think about the impact of these new kinds of contracts on the expectations workers and employers have of each other, as well as the kinds of claims they can make and the nature of loyalty between them, right? Increasing social mobility across jobs. Second, I'll touch on work location, thinking about what we gain and lose when we work from home and some of the gendered effects that we see there. I'll then talk a little bit about diversity, something that's clearly been in the news lately, who belongs in the workplace, and what are the legitimate strategies that organizations can use to address diversity. And lastly, I'll talk a little bit about automation and AI, who's affected by automation today, and who should be responsible for managing the transition. All right, so first on the employment relationship, we can think about this in terms of the increasing number of options that employers have for filling a job, right? Not only can you use a regular employee these days or a part-time employee, you can also employ a contract firm who's gonna provide you with workers on a regular basis. You can use a temp agency that will send people sort of occasionally when you need them. You can contract one-on-one with an independent contractor. And increasingly, we think about how some jobs might just be allocated to algorithms and AI. And what's interesting to me here is that the relationship between employers and workers really differs across these different arrangements. Now, alternative work arrangements are actually a pretty small proportion of the US workforce at any given point in time, right? The BLS tells us that less than around 30% of people at any given time are employed in alternative work arrangements. Using a slightly different strategy, Pew asks people whether they've ever worked as a gig worker before and finds that about 15% of American workers say they have done this kind of work in the past. So I asked my MBA students a similar question to what Pew asks, and you can see that there's many more of them who have experience in alternative work arrangements, right? So although a small proportion of the US workforce is employed this way at any given point in time, many American workers are actually experiencing alternative work at some point in their careers. And this can have pretty profound impacts on workers, right? I'll just run really quickly through some research findings. People who look at gig workers have found that they experienced heightened loneliness, right? Not only do they not have teams they're working with, but they're also not interacting with a manager. They're being managed by an algorithm. That algorithmic management also has an impact on trust, right? People don't like when an algorithm is making decisions for them, particularly when those decisions are perceived to be human-like decisions, for instance, about work evaluation or hiring. Another form of alternative work that scholars have been looking at is on-call work, people whose schedule varies from week to week, and they often find out with very short notice. And they find there pretty profound effects on people's psychological well-being, right? Not only the focal employee, but also their families experienced heightened levels of distress. And then having alternative workers on site also has impacts on people's managerial relationships. So this is research that looks at the impact of different kinds of alternative workers on permanent full-time employees. And it finds that temp workers in particular have a negative impact on full-time employees' sense of job security, their pride, the trust they have in their organization, and the quality of their managerial relationship. And the researcher posits that this is because permanent employees perceive temp workers to be perhaps a substitute for them. And when temp employees show up on site, they think that perhaps their employer is starting to relax their commitment to a long-term, full-time kind of arrangement. So there's all these impacts on the worker. We can also think about the impacts of alternative work arrangements on society more broadly. And here, I like to draw on a news article from a couple years ago that compares these two women who started out as janitors at tech companies at very different moments in history. So on the left, we have Gail Evans, who started out as a janitor at Kodak in the 1980s. And on the right, we have Marta Ramos, who was a janitor at Apple at the time when the article was written. Now, Gail Evans started as a janitor at Kodak, but because she was a Kodak employee and not employed through a contracting agency, she had the same benefits as other employees, including educational benefits. She was taking classes outside work. She started to learn new technical skills. Somebody found out that she had these new technical skills and asked her to come conduct a workshop for their professional employees. She ended up moving on to a professional track, and 10 years later, she was the head of technology for the company. Now, obviously, Gail Evans is an exceptional person. Most people who started as janitors at Kodak did not end up as the head of technology. But the fact is that her trajectory was enabled by a particular employment model that Kodak used that Apple doesn't use. She was employed directly by Kodak, and Kodak was invested in promoting people from within, bringing people up. They thought that firm-specific knowledge was really valuable, and she wouldn't have been able to do that, to move up in the way she did without those commitments. By contrast, Marta Ramos is employed through a contracted agency, right? If she wants to move up in her career, she can become a team lead at that agency. But if she wants to move further, she's going to have to move out to move up, at which point all she has on her resume is, I worked for a janitorial contractor. She can't say I worked for Apple. So there are these serious impacts on people's ability to move up that we see in this new employment model, this more fissured workplace, as David Weil has put it. In addition, in our current arrangement, we see that these different organizations can exert downward wage pressure on one another. So Marta's employer can keep her wages low because Apple says, if you don't keep your costs low, we're going to go with a different contractor. So these have impacts on us as a society more broadly. Second, I'd like to just touch on what we're seeing in terms of changing work location. Many people have referred to COVID-19 as a massive experiment in changing how we work, namely where we work. And what we see is that the impact of this experiment has been pretty sticky. Several years later, researchers found that 41% of people who could work remotely were doing some remote work. And over a quarter of paid work days were being conducted from somewhere other than the office or work site. And people reported that this was really beneficial to them. One day of working remotely had a 5 to 10% increase on their feeling of work-life balance. Now, what I like about the headline is that it emphasizes that the office was never one size fits all to begin with, and that's why we're seeing these positive benefits. So it was never one size fits all. It was really designed for something that sociologists call the ideal worker, right? The ideal worker is a norm that we hold in our head. It's a standard against which we evaluate other people, right? This norm includes a number of components, right? It includes the idea that the office is separate from the home, that work is full-time, you arrive at a set time and leave at a set time. Even somebody who works the night shift, for instance, might be perceived as violating this ideal worker norm. Work is supposed to be your main aspiration. Your non-work activities are subordinate to work. They're either delegated to a spouse or a care worker, or they're confined to your time off the clock. And your employment is continuous without breaks. And so, although employment might be formally open to everyone, this ideal worker norm makes it very hard for some people to successfully fulfill expectations, right? Because we have this standard in our head against which we are evaluating everyone. And the office was really crucial to enforcing the ideal worker norm through the process of informal monitoring. One example here is the fact that in the office, people often experience phenomena like time policing or flex time stigma, where even though they have formal benefits that allow them to accommodate work and life, for instance, by leaving early if they have to, for instance, pick up a kid from school, they either don't use those benefits or they experience penalties for using those benefits because it violates that norm, that ideal worker norm. And so in one really interesting study, people found that a simple intervention really reduced flex time stigma. If you actually changed people from assigned seating to flexible seating, people were much more likely to use their flex time. That's because they didn't feel like they were going to be policed in the same way. If you don't know where someone is supposed to be sitting and they leave at 4 p.m. instead of 5, then you don't know to penalize them in your mind. Right? So we have these negative impacts of the office, but at the same time, the office has had some profound positives for people. Right? It provides a sense of community. You see this often when you look at independent contractors and gig workers who feel isolated. They feel a lack of support, a lack of community. The office was also really beneficial for enforcing boundaries, right? So in one study, a qualitative study, Mary Blair Loy found that people who had more flexible work arrangements were more likely to engage in overwork, more likely to just keep working on and on and on once they went home. And so in new research that I'm conducting, we're looking at how work from home actually reinscribes gender norms in ways that negatively impact women's careers. What we see when we look at time use data is that when men and women have access to flex time, but not remote work, the gender gap closes. When you have flex time alone, women do less housework and do more paid work. But when you add remote work into the picture, that improvement in gender equity disappears. Women start doing more housework and start doing less paid work. So at home, those gender norms are being reinscribed. Third, I'll just talk very briefly about the changing landscape around diversity. Obviously, this was a significant priority for the Trump administration, which has attacked diversity initiatives both within the federal government, where they shut down those initiatives and asked employees to report on others at their organization who might continue pursuing DEI under other names. This is an email that went out to people in the Veterans Administration saying, please report on anyone you think is pursuing DEI under a name other than DEI. You won't be penalized if you report them inaccurately. You will be penalized if you fail to report them. So they are attacking DEI internally, but also in the private sector and close to home in universities. And we're seeing that this is really changing the way organizations invest in diversity. We've seen rollbacks at almost every major American corporation, and even at universities, we've seen scrubbing of references to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and other changes in attempt to avoid the attention of the Trump administration. Now, of course, this sits in a much longer history of push and pull of forces in American society that are attempting to change the way we think about inequality, right? So if we take the case of racial equity, we've seen a long history where one set of forces push towards more equity, and then another set of forces push back, right? So Reconstruction triggered Jim Crow. Over many decades following Jim Crow, we saw a developing sense of resistance that culminated in the civil rights movement, which then triggered this backlash in the very active erosion of civil rights gains through the courts. Again to Black Lives Matter and on now to the DEI backlash. And what I think is really interesting here is that these are debates over material benefits and opportunities, who should get jobs, who should get certain kinds of material rewards, but they're also attempts to change the common sense of inequality, right? Reconstruction was not just about giving certain people certain material goods, it was also trying to get us to change the way we think about who belongs in society. But just as that starts to get normalized, there's a backlash that tries to push in the other direction and tries to normalize a different set of assumptions. And so in some work that I'm doing now, we're looking at these two very different mindsets that people can have about the relationship between diversity and meritocracy. We describe this as diversity equals meritocracy and diversity versus meritocracy, right? So diversity equals meritocracy is a mindset in which you primarily think about underrepresented groups as being disadvantaged by structural exclusion or bias. They have less access to opportunity, and so standard qualifications do not fully capture their capabilities. As a result, pursuing diversity overcomes existing biases and helps us actually improve the meritocratic nature of our outcomes, right? But an alternative mindset suggests that diversity is in tension with meritocracy. I see this all the time in my MBA classes where students raise their hand and say, doesn't diversity erode our ability to achieve meritocracy? We sort of map out the underlying beliefs that are happening here, that underrepresented groups are disadvantaged primarily by their own behaviors or choices, that they do have equal access to opportunity, and as a result, standard qualifications should accurately reflect their capabilities. And as a result, people who have this mindset conclude that pursuing diversity introduces bias and interrupts meritocratic outcomes. So what we try and do in this research is capture the extent to which people agree with one of these positions or the other. We have a zero-sum scale we're developing where we ask questions like, to what extent do you agree that a company that improves its diversity compromises its commitment to meritocracy? We find that zero-sum thinking along these lines is correlated with political identification, but not perfectly. So you actually see a spike in zero-sum thinking among people who identify as moderates. And we show that this predicts a number of things, but one of them is how people make attributions for why someone was hired. So we show them a vignette in which two candidates who are designed to be identical, one of those two people was hired for an opportunity, and we find people that have more zero-sum thinking are more likely to attribute the hire of the Black person to diversity initiatives and more likely to attribute the hire of the white person to merit. So what does this mean? This means that if you have a prevalence of zero-sum thinking at your organization and you hire people from underrepresented groups, they're going to encounter the problem of being presumed to be a diversity hire, of having their competence called into question, of people assuming they're not there because of merit. So this will have profound impacts on people's lives. So lastly, just to briefly touch on the issue of automation, AI, and reskilling, the current moment sits in a long history in which technology has reshaped how we value certain people's work, right? New technologies always replace some kinds of labor and shift demands and rewards for work. We saw this, of course, with the introduction of computers, which made the value of work for people at the top of the income distribution much higher and sort of hollowed out some of the middle, more routine white-collar functions that we used to have, contributing to income inequality. What's changing with AI is whose work is being impacted. So we're not just automating routine work, we're also automating creative and intellectual labor. So this is an article that I really like from New York Magazine, where the graphic designer at New York Magazine tries to get an early version of ChatGPT to do their job for them. And so she gives the ChatGPT the same prompts she got from her editor, right? Museums are trying to figure out what NFT art is worth. On the left, we have her illustration. On the right, we have the first thing ChatGPT came up with, obviously not particularly satisfying. But then she walks through how she starts to learn how to use the platform, and she arrives ultimately at something very similar to what she was going for in her own illustration, right? And so what we have in the current moment is a different set of people whose work is being potentially automated. This raises, of course, the question of who stands to gain. For the most part, we tend to think of AI as a leveler, right? We see a lot of studies like the one here in this figure, where the people who gain the most from access to AI are the people who perform sort of worse than average prior to using AI, right? Getting access to these tools tends to bring people up to average performance. And so people who were already good performers get maybe a little bit of a benefit, but people who were low performers can do much better. But there's also a set of instances that might make us think of AI as instead an amplifier, right? So you need a certain amount of knowledge in order to identify errors in the output of AI. Right? AI is going to produce both type 1 errors and type 2 errors. It's both going to tell you things are true when they're not, and it's going to tell you things, it's going to leave things out that in fact should be incorporated. And the only way to know whether there's been an error is if you already have some knowledge, right? This is why we want students to do their own work instead of using AI, is they have to do the work to develop the knowledge that will allow them to use AI effectively in the future. So when we think about the impact AI is likely to have on people's work, the question here is, for whom is it going to be a complement and for whom is it going to be a substitute? There was an article a few years ago that looked at the case of radiologists, where they sort of talk about how this person who helped design some machine learning said that people should stop training radiologists because within 5 years, deep learning is going to be better than radiologists. And the author says, well, that's not so true. If you look at it, actually, demand for radiologists has continued. People outperform AI on identifying rare conditions. People are crucial to helping patients as they navigate new technologies in the healthcare system. And so the author concludes, will AI replace radiologists? No, that's a silly question. What we actually need to know is that radiologists who use AI will replace radiologists who don't. Now, I think that this is slightly naive, right? If you have a radiologist using AI, that's great. You probably need fewer radiologists, right? So some radiologists are going to be out of a job. And what I've seen among MBA students is that they can't really conceptualize this, right? They know there's going to be some decline in demand, but they find it hard to understand how that's going to impact their career. So I asked my 350 MBA students, what are you going to do to insulate yourself from the impact of automation? And I heard basically the same thing from all of them. What these quotes say, I'll just summarize for you, is I'm going to know how to use AI better than the guy next to me. Now, I don't know that that's a very good strategy for insulating yourself from AI. Maybe as an individual, it sounds smart, but as a collective, I don't see how that helps to solve our problem. So that lands us here. Whose problem is it to facilitate this transition that we're facing? Again, I surveyed the MBA students, and I find that a surprising number of them think that employers and the government should be responsible for helping retrain workers for a new AI future. Interestingly, the other consists of people saying all of the above. Universities, I don't know how they think we're going to solve the problem, but we can ask them. Public-private partnerships, or a surprising number of people who say no one. They say it's part of the process, I have no idea, or the market. So we can talk about the validity of these responses as we go forward. So I've talked about 4 transformations in the workplace that we're seeing today: changes in the employment relationship, changes in where we conduct our work, changing beliefs about how we should invest in diversity, and how automation and AI are impacting our work, and I look forward to talking about these things with Brian and David. Thank you so much.
All right, who's ready for round two? Hi, everybody. As Brian mentioned, this is great for me. This is a homecoming for me. I'm a proud Buckeye, graduated 23 years ago, but I'm back, and things have changed a little bit, but not too much. I still remember I lived in Bradley Hall down the way, which maybe I'll go visit later on. Anyway, so it's great to be back. As Brian mentioned, I'm an economist, and I study labor markets and education. And long before AI, I was interested in, I would say that the real question that animates much of my work, maybe all of my work, is what are people capable of, and how do the things that people can do relate to their ability to earn a living? So human potential, skills, education, training, everything in between. And so when AI started to come along, I mean, it's interesting because when people think of AI, they think of generative AI, which is like ChatGPT and large language models, which are quite new, 2.5 years old. But actually, in some sense, AI has been with us a lot longer. There's an older literature in economics and in social science of studying, and in the field, and studying what I would call predictive AI, which is basically using big data techniques to make predictions in a very customized way. So if we've all been using AI for a long time. If you ever use autocomplete on your phone, that's an AI-based algorithm. If you've gone on Amazon and they've offered you a set of personalized recommendations for product offerings and prices, that's also AI. And so you've seen predictive AI models around for a long time. It turns out a lot of that same underlying technology can be used to predict the next word in a very customized way. And so that's something that speaks to a lot of people, and companies like OpenAI and Anthropic have created these very consumer-facing technologies that make it very accessible. And I think actually if you read some interviews with Sam Altman and other people around OpenAI at the time it was released, I don't think they even really understood what an impact ChatGPT was going to have, because actually GPT-2 and 2.5 and 3 were already around for a while. And like DeepSeek came out, and it was that model, the model weights and all that were around for a while, but then all of a sudden they made this consumer-facing thing that allowed you to just type in questions and get answers back. And that's the thing that really feels like sorcery to a lot of people, including me still. But it's important to recognize that actually the underpinnings of that technology have been around a while. And it's important because it gives us some sense, some capability of predicting what might come if you kind of think about what the technology is actually doing and what really the change is relative to existing work that's out there. And so what is it really doing? So I think at a kind of, I'm not an expert on the mechanics of the estimation of the models, but I can tell you at some level what it's trying to do, which is basically take a bunch of data about the past to make some really nuanced prediction about the future. And the models work really well in settings where the past is a good guide to the future, right? So if you're trying to write a recommendation letter for a graduate student, I would never do this, okay, but hypothetically, if you're trying to write a recommendation letter, the model is basically, to a first approximation, trained on the entirety of the internet. The internet contains many such recommendation letters. And so if you say like, I want to write a recommendation letter for a student and they're applying to this school, like it'll sort of take those details and then it'll search the entire corpus of the internet, more or less. It's not exactly doing that, but let's just, for the purpose of discussion, assume that. And it'll say so when you query the model, you're basically telling it to look in a particular corner of the internet for something. Okay, it's not exactly like that. Maybe Brian can correct me since he's an expert on the technical side of it, but you should think about it sort of like that. And so that's why little things you say, like if you tell it you're an expert PhD economist, it'll go to the expert PhD economist corner of the internet and give you a different answer than if you say you're a journalist, right? And so what it's basically doing is it's searching in the right space, and it's making a prediction about what you want based on what it's asked, and it's using as its training all of the things that exist out there, okay? And so it's kind of trained on this great social experiment we've been running for 30 years or so, where all or most of human knowledge exists on the internet and is freely available to anyone. And that's really the engine that's powering a lot of these models. And so why do I say that? I say that to illustrate that first of all, it's not actually obvious how it'll be used to replace work. I think people tend to say, well, this thing is really smart and intelligence is important in work, and so ... that means it's going to replace your job. But I think one of the things you need to think about when you're trying to make predictions about it is that it's not going to it's not going to replace people until it replaces every aspect of your job. And there are some things that AI can do quite well already, and some things that it can't do very well at all. It doesn't exist very well in the physical world right now. And most people, unless your job is literally just answering emails all day, you have aspects of your job that are physical, you have aspects of your job that are relational, and you have aspects of your job that are cognitive or intellectual. And it's going to replace those latter ones a lot faster than it's going to replace the former. And so if you think about that, and again, it doesn't, just because it can do the thing doesn't mean it can do it as well as you or as cheaply as you. And so you may, I think, much more likely than replacing work, you'll have a situation where it's going to change all of our jobs in a really fundamental way. And so maybe I'll just tell you in a few minutes kind of how I think about this based on the work that I've done and some recent work I've done on AI and some broad lessons I've learned and give you a sense of how I've arrived at them, and then we can have a discussion. So first thing is I've kind of done one project that's on, I would say, like looking at AI adoption from the ground up. So conducting the first nationally representative survey of generative AI usage in the US with a couple of colleagues, Alex Bick and Adam Blandon. We're doing the survey every 3 months where we track AI usage among people and by occupation and by income and ask people questions about how they use it, how much they use it, how many days a week they use it, how much time does it save them, what do they use it for, all kinds of details about that. And then I've done another paper with Chris Ong and Larry Summers about the macroeconomic impacts of AI, which is a bit more speculative because it's just starting to come along. But we take as our training data, if you like, the past of how have major technologies disrupted the US labor market. Like, for example, when the economy electrified in the early 20th century, electricity was a pretty transformative technology, right? And so the past is not a perfect guide to the future, but if you want to look at what happens when work really changes as a result of a general purpose technology, things like electricity, steam power, the personal computer, those are pretty good guides to what we would expect. And so we wrote a paper looking at the history of technological disruption over the last 150 years of the labor market, trying to learn lessons about what might be coming down the pike. So for the first one, the survey side, I would say, I'll explain to you what we did, but let me just tell you the high-level takeaways from it. One is that the adoption of generative AI in the past 2 years, so dated roughly since the release of ChatGPT, has been as fast and probably even faster than the adoption of personal computers and the internet at the same stage of their technologies. And so what that tells you is, if you think about when the personal computer came out, the IBM PC was first released in 1981. If I went back to 1981, for those of you who were around then, and I showed you the future, and I showed you how ubiquitous the personal computer is in everyday life, do that same thought experiment with AI. It's likely to be on that scale in the sense the computers are basically everywhere and they guide every aspect in our life. They in some sense can't even fully be captured by data, right? Because everything you do is on a computer and it's the medium through which you get a lot of work done and also do a lot of leisure time, iPads, like everything, the cell phone, everything in some sense is downstream of all that. And so if you want to think about what's likely coming down the pike with AI, you should think about it as it's eventually probably going to be on the same scale as the internet and personal computers. How do we know that? Well, we conducted this survey using a tool we call the RPS, the Real-Time Population Survey. We call it that because it's an analog of something called the Current Population Survey, which, I don't know if you guys know about this, this is basically the most widely used labor market survey. It's the most important labor market survey in the US. Every month, we have a release of the unemployment numbers, and the economy added you might read in the paper, the economy added 150,000 jobs this month, the unemployment rate is this. The source for that is the monthly Current Population Survey. Now, we would love it if the Current Population Survey added questions about AI. They haven't done that. So what we did was we created an exact copy of the survey, the question ordering, the structure of the CPS. So we have the exact same questions that are on the CPS given in the same order in the same reference week as the CPS. And we contract with a private survey company to administer all those questions, the same questions the CPS gives, and then we add a module about generative AI on it. So what that does is it allows it, and we give the survey company a set of demographic quotas to try to make it representative of the CPS population, which is people roughly ages 18 to 64 is what we're interested in. And the CPS asks these very complicated questions about employment. That's how they get the unemployment rate. So what we can do is we can say, well, when we do that with a private survey company, do we get statistics for people that make them look like they're about as representative as the CPS? So we can actually ask the question, does our survey look like the people in the CPS? Both with respect to demographic characteristics, but also with respect to things like how many hours did you work last week? Were you looking for work? How many jobs do you have? And so we can show actually in our survey that the people in our survey look a lot like the CPS people. And then any differences, we can just weight the data to be exactly representative of the CPS. So I say that all to tell you that this is like approximating the thought experiment of what if the CPS, at the end of the month, when you get the jobs day report, you also get the AI report. That's kind of what we wanted to recreate. Okay. And so we found is back in August and still about today, we're doing this every 3 months, about 40% of people are using generative AI, let's say, at least once in the last month. So like, let's call them just at least users as a curiosity. Okay. About a third of people are using it at work, and about a third of people are using it outside of work. We don't say using it at home because some people work from home. So it's work and outside of work. And then we ask people, how often do you use it? And about a quarter, a bit less than a quarter, 24% of people used it at work at least once in the last week. That number is increasing a little bit over time, but it's been pretty stable since August. And about 1 in 9 people say they use it every day at work. Usage is higher in the kind of occupation categories you would predict, things like computer scientists and managers and things like that. But it's actually shockingly broad-based. So 1 in 6 blue-collar workers say they used it at least once in the last week at work. Okay. So, and when you compare that, and the really valuable thing about this is that the CPS actually, when the personal computer came out, started asking questions about PC usage. They have a thing called the Personal Computer and Internet Usage Supplement. So they have these questions back in the 80s about when people use computers. And so we can say, well, if we date the beginning of PCs to the IBM PC in 1981, if you look at computer usage in 1984, that's 3 years after the PC was released. It was the first computer to sell at least 1 million copies. And then we say that's the beginning of the computer. And then November 2022, when ChatGPT was out, is the beginning of generative AI. And so we can kind of put them on the same scale and say from 0 to 2 years, 3 years later, what was the pattern of adoption? And we can do the same thing for the internet, which we date to 1995, which was when Netscape IPO'd and when the NSF allowed the internet to be used for commercial traffic. So it's generally thought to be the beginning. And by the way, we asked ChatGPT what are good dates for these technologies, and it agreed with our assessments. Okay. So if you date it by that, what you can compare the adoption rates and the speed of adoption across these 3 technologies. Okay. And so we found basically was personal computer usage was a few percentage points lower at work, but much lower at home compared to generative AI. And internet usage was also lower at this point in the technology's life cycle. And so what that tells, again, that's why I'm saying it's on the same scale as these other 2 technologies. And PC usage was much more concentrated. So PC usage was obviously common in computer and math occupations and common among occupations like secretaries and administrative assistants. But most people weren't using computers, whereas almost everybody in every type of occupation and industry is using AI. Okay? So by that standard, we can say, look, it seems like it's being used almost everywhere. It's being used pretty regularly. And then we ask people questions about time savings. And because we know how many days of the week people use it, and then we ask them on the days you use it, how many hours, how much time do you spend using it? So we can kind of add those things up and estimate like what share of the average work week is spent using AI. And then finally, we ask people, when you used it, when you used AI, how much time did it save you? And the way we ask is we say, if you had not had this technology, how much more time would it have taken you to use it? And so people give that answer, and we use that to basically back out a productivity calculation. So we say, you used it for, we estimate between 1% and 5% of all work hours are currently being assisted with generative AI in the US right now. Okay, and that counts non-users. Most people don't use it at all. So between 1% and 5%. And it turns out it's saving people a pretty substantial amount of time. It's saving people something like between 1% and 3% of all work hours. So that's pretty substantial. It doesn't sound like a big number. But what it works out to is every hour you spend using AI on average, based on people's reported time savings, it's making them about 30% more productive. Okay? And this is like, what does this mean? It means like, the boss says, I need you to write me a memo on topic X, have it on my desk in 2 days, and maybe you use ChatGPT and it takes you 1 day, or it takes you half a day, or it takes you 2 hours. Right? So that's kind of tangibly how it works. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that's going to redound to the benefit of the economy in the form of productivity benefits. Why? Because one of the striking things about AI is that consumer usage is much higher than firm adoption. Okay, so like 40% of people say they use it, but if you ask companies, do you have a formal AI use policy, it's like 6 to 7% of companies are using it. So what does that tell you? It tells you a lot of worker usage is actually informal, or on the sly, if you like. So the company's not saying don't use it, but they're not saying use it. And so when the boss says, have the memo on my desk in 2 days, you can use AI to write the memo in 2 hours, and then you go to the bar. Right? Maybe you don't go to the bar. Maybe I would go to the bar. State school boy. So what that means is that's not going to show up in the productivity statistics, because workers are basically using it as leisure in a sense. Like it's like saying the boss wants you to have this thing. They have this expectation it's going to take you a long time to do something with AI, but actually it doesn't. But that's not a stable equilibrium. So what you'll see over the next few years over time is that the expectations of white-collar knowledge workers, the kinds of people for whom AI is very useful, companies are going to start to say, okay, now I need the memo on my desk in 2 hours because I know you have this tool. And so that's, I think, the change we're going to see in the short term is a ratcheting up of the expectations of knowledge work because of the availability of this tool. And you'll see companies start to roll out more formal use policies and kind of take control over the productivity gains in a way that will show up more in the productivity data, but will be less fun for workers. And there is some analogy to remote work with this, which is when we started to go to remote work in the pandemic, right? It was kind of like people could maybe not work quite as much and nobody knew, and now employers are kind of taking back control. So I think you'll see that with AI. And then maybe the last thing I'll say before we just take questions is on the macro side. That's the micro side. On the macro side, I think there's really 3 lessons that we learned, and you can read the paper. I can share it later if you're interested. But there's really 3 lessons we learned. One is that in order to understand technological adoption and how it affects the labor market, you really need to get into the details. You really need to look and see how the technology is being used on the ground. The error that people make often is they assume because a technology is scientifically amazing that it will automatically lead to big changes in the economy. There's a great quote, I forget who gave it, but I'm going to use it without attribution, it's not mine. Somebody says, there are very few AI-sized holes in the economy. What do they mean by that? They mean that there's not a lot of processes where you just plug in the AI and magic happens. Actually, a lot of things need to be reconfigured and changed to make optimal use of this technology. So even if you have freely available intelligence, a lot of business processes are not optimized for that. And so companies need to change what they do in order to benefit, and that takes time. And I can give you one example from electricity. So one of the things about electricity that was so powerful as a technology is it's a decentralized power source. Prior to electricity, most factories were powered by a steam engine. So it's basically some giant engine in the middle of the factory, and the power radiates outward from there, and so everything has to be designed around this central power source. Okay? But electricity is much easier to distribute through electric lines or through current. And so it took businesses time to basically completely re-engineer the factory floor so that machine power could be distributed around to different sources and you could have different tools that do different things instead of organizing it all centrally. So that's one lesson, just very concrete lesson you learn. And so actually, like, Thomas Edison patented the incandescent light bulb in 1870 and then opened up the first power plant in New York City in 1899. But the US economy was not fully, or at least more than half electrified until the end of the 1920s or the early 1930s. So it took 50, 60 years from the commercial invention of this really important technology, which everybody knew at the time was going to be a big deal, or people who were paying attention. It still took time for the economy to reorganize production. And you'll see that with AI, which is like, you can see in a moment how much everything's going to change, but it takes forever to actually change. So it's going to be slower. It's going to be a big deal, but it's going to be slower than you think. The other thing is about these technologies you have to remember is that AI, it's not just the AI itself, if it really is a general purpose technology. The history of that is that the ultimate impacts on the economy often come from downstream complementary innovation. Okay? So what was it about electricity that was so great? It's that when you can use electricity for everything, all of a sudden you can invent personal appliances. So you've got the microwave, the dishwasher, the oven, right? The laundry. These all sound like trivial things, but these were things that like freed up, for example, female labor supply. Like people spent basically 40 to 50 hours a week cooking and cleaning 100 years ago. And electricity lowered that by so much that it unlocked the ability for, at the time it was mostly women staying at home doing this, and it just unlocked a ton of new labor because we freed up time to do other things. And that was not something that probably Thomas Edison foresaw when he patented the light bulb. Right? Because it wasn't about electricity, it was all the things that electricity unlocks, which is I can have a distributed power source in my home much more cheaply. I don't need to build a giant steam engine in my living room, right? So that's an example of, it's not so much and I think AI is like that too. Like ultimately, LLMs are, for most people, just a cute tool, right? But what you'll see is new businesses will start that'll be built on a foundation of freely available intelligence. And they will be unpredictably amazing and new. And that will be the ultimate unlock for the economy in ways that are, I think, very hard for us to predict sitting here right now. That's lesson number 2. And I think the last lesson, one of my favorite ones, because it's a very economics-focused lesson, is in order to think about whether AI is going to replace labor, you don't just want to look at what's happening now. You need to look at the other side, the demand side, human needs, human wants. So I would ask you, what share of the jobs in the economy are actually fundamental to the survival of the human race? If you're a farmer, fine, okay. But most of the jobs we do are actually based on some human desire. They're not, strictly speaking, necessary. Right? Like, in some sense, we academics, we like to think of us as, scholars, we're in the temple. We're entertainers in a way. Like, we're producing knowledge that people find interesting. But, like, if my job went away tomorrow, the human race would go on. Okay, and that's true for many of our jobs. And what it underscores is the fact that most of the economy and most of what people consider valuable is driven by interests, is driven by consumer preferences. Okay, and so what you have to look at is when we get richer and more prosperous, when AI makes us more productive, what are we going to want more of? So if you look at the history of the US labor market, it used to be that 40% of the economy was in agriculture. 2 of every 5 jobs was in farming. Now it's less than 2%. Why? Because when we got more productive in farming, we didn't want more food. We only want so much food. So when you get more productive, you need fewer people to do the work, and then you reallocate the work to something else that we want. So we went from sustenance and survival to now we have occupational therapists, and we have graphic designers, and we have all kinds of jobs that are nice to haves rather than need to haves. But what are the things we want when we get richer? Well, we want to live longer. We want to be healthier. We want more education. And so I don't think that AI will replace jobs in healthcare and education and other high-end services, because those are the things that we demand more when we get richer. You know, it's not like we said, oh, well, now that we've cured polio and measles, we're good. We don't want any more healthcare. Like, we're good. No, like the frontier keeps moving outward. You want to live longer. You want to live healthier. You want to be happier. So mental health services, right? Personal trainers, fitness. We want to look good. We want to be in shape, right? And positional goods, where it's really just about status, and which is a lot of things. Like, you just want something that other people don't have. So even if you could have an AI personal assistant that's better than most personal assistants now, there will always be a high-end market for the bespoke. You know, you can have the commodity, which is the AI assistant that's the same for everyone, or you can have a person that attends to you. And you sort of want that because it's a signal of prestige and because it's a relationship. It's not just an assistant. And so I think what you'll see is the economy turning even more than it already is into high-end customized services that are really about human nature and relationships and building relationships. Like, you could have an AI soccer coach or an AI mentor that might in some sense be more intelligent than a person, but nobody wants that. You want the relationship. The point is the relationship. And so for any jobs like that, which is a growing share of jobs, I don't think you'll see AI ever replace those jobs, because having another person there is the point. Thanks.
So I can sit between y'all. All right, so we'll talk for a few minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions from y'all. Before I say anything that might take the conversation in a particular direction, do you have anything you want to say in reply to anything that was said?
Well, I have a lot of questions, but I feel like you should kick us off.
Yeah, let's get into it.
Okay.
Let's chop it up.
So we can do it. So I'll say a couple things about automation and possible limits, like, of artificial intelligence, just to like maybe give us some landscape to see what we think. To supplement some of the stuff we were saying about like AI amplifying jobs and what sort of things might actually be, what sort of jobs might actually be replaced and that kind of thing. And so when we talk about artificial intelligence taking jobs, we often do focus on like automation, but that's a choice, like in a way that is often overlooked. And so this is what is identified as the source of what this computer scientist named Eric Brynjolfsson calls the Turing trap. And this is after Alan Turing, right? And so what Brynjolfsson thinks is that the sort of focus on automating human tasks, that is using artificial intelligence to replace human tasks, is a preoccupation that basically comes from the history of artificial intelligence, because that's how Turing started it out, right? And when you focus on developing, and then now there are all sorts of incentives among business people, among like innovators, among policymakers, to continue to basically do it that way, right? But that's a choice. And so what Brynjolfsson does is draw this distinction between automating tasks and what he calls augmenting, like, human labor, right? And he said, and his thought is that if we focus exclusively or continue to incentivize automation, then that's when we end up getting these big power inequalities and economic inequalities. But he says he thinks it's a choice to augment, right? And now, how do you actually carry this off is an interesting question. But the idea is that if we focus more on augmenting, or I think kind of like what you were saying, amplifying human tasks, then folks still have a role to play in the workforce in particular ways that may involve not doing away with jobs in the same way. Right. So the difference there between like should this particular, is it best to augment this task versus is it best to automate this task is a choice, right? But like I say, in a culture that incentivizes one already, like how we actually do it is another question. I'm thinking of like what is best, right? Were you gonna say something?
Yeah, I just think it's a really important point, and it's one of the questions I had for David, which is how you think about the context in which the implementation of these new tools is being made, and specifically the context that defines the relative power of workers and employers. Right? So one can imagine that depending on who has the power in a particular labor market, right, whether the labor market is tighter or whether there's higher unemployment, that will have an effect on who basically captures the gains from AI, right? And so I guess I wonder how you think about that. I hope this is building on what you were saying. How you think about that and maybe what role government should have in trying to shape the relative power of those parties through social policy to ensure that the gains from these technologies are broadly distributed and aren't just captured by corporations.
Well, that's a big question. I mean, I guess I definitely agree that that the impacts of technology are not just preordained. They depend on the interaction between the technology's capabilities itself and then how they're, I guess, mediated by institutions. And you see this actually with there's a big increase in economic and wage inequality in the U.S. in the 1980s after the personal computer was widely adopted and the internet was widely adopted, so 80s and 90s. And on the one hand, that increase in inequality and the growing returns to a college education happened all around the world. So it was clearly a technological impact because it was, hey, computers are everywhere. At the same time, the growth in wage inequality was much greater in the US than it was in, let's say, France or in the UK because of institutions, because we have a much more market-oriented economy, and so it was easier to reprice, less collective bargaining, lower minimum wage. So all these things interact with the technology in ways to create the ultimate final impact. So I think that's right. With respect to AI, maybe I'll come to the regulation thing in a second, but I actually in some way think that the way the technology has been rolled out was actually maximally egalitarian in a way. Like there's another version of this where OpenAI, who is funded by Microsoft, keeps the technology private to themselves, and Microsoft starts automating tasks within Microsoft and doesn't share it with the world. But OpenAI made a choice, based in part at least on the, putative idea that they were a nonprofit. I mean, they're sort of not really, but like, if you think about what they're doing is creating this incredibly powerful technology and then letting anybody use it for free. It's pretty open source relative to some other alternative. That doesn't mean that the technology won't ultimately increase inequality or anything else, but I kind of find it hard to imagine, other than just like never creating it in the first place out of fear of its negative potential. Like, it's hard for me to imagine a more democratic introduction to an important new technology than something like this, and like it's not even clear that I think they're losing quite a bit of money by doing this, and like the subscriptions are pretty cheap, and actually with like models like DeepSeek, like the ones that came out, it seems like maybe these models are going to be commodified, that like maybe these companies don't really have a mode, and so what you get is you've got these big companies like just to step back on it, big companies like Microsoft, Google, investing billions of dollars to create something that most people will be able to use for free. And I think they're doing it because they have different goals for how to use it. But like, there's a way of looking at it that's kind of like, actually they're creating a lot of value for the world. I mean, again, not out of the goodness of their hearts, they're corporations, but that have a duty to maximize profits. But in a way, the fact that they have so much market power and such huge stockpiles of cash was the thing that made this possible in the first place. So I find it a little hard to think about because labor market inequality existed before AI, and AI may make it worse. But it's hard for me to point to any particular action that any of these companies have taken that has like aggravated it.
Yeah, I guess I've been thinking a lot about, some of the things you were discussing, right? Which is right now, because companies, as you noted, are not taking advantage of these technologies, but workers are, right? The gains of these technologies are going to workers. But from my perspective, that's just a matter of time, right? It's only a matter of time. In my class, people say, oh, I'm a consultant and now I can do the amount of work it used to take me a week to do in one day. It's only a matter of time before their employer says, oh, well, I don't need 5 workers, I only need 1, right? If they can do the same amount, unless they can, maybe down the line, there's new market opportunities that emerge because of the technologies and consultants have more work to do. Yeah. Maybe that's optimistically going to happen down the line. But in the meanwhile, there is some sort of push and pull between workers and employers around whether this is going to make work easier for workers or whether there's going to be fewer jobs, right? And so how do we think about what, insofar as this is putatively a session on social policy. Yeah. How do we think about the role of social policy in trying to sort of influence that trajectory?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a good question. I think again, like, and I maybe it sounds like I'm trying to be contrarian, but I don't think I am. Like, actually, if what happens is McKinsey hires fewer consultants and has a smaller business, and instead we have more carpenters and plumbers and electricians, that seems pretty good for U.S. wage inequality. So I look at I think you're right that down the line, but what I see now is actually like a pretty fundamental repricing of potential for a pretty fundamental repricing of skills in the labor market that's kind of reducing inequality, at least in the short run. And you see, and some of this predates AI actually. So like, in some ways, as academics, we're always kind of fighting the last war. But if you look at wage trends since the pandemic, this has actually been one of the most hopeful times for the compression of wage inequality. Like, wages have gone way up at the bottom end in the US since the pandemic, so the past 5 or 6 years. And so inequality is actually down substantially from when it was in the 2000s. I don't think that's because of AI, because a lot of it predates AI. But it's hard for me to, like, I used to teach a class about inequality, so like I'm hardwired to look for these things. But when I look at what I'm seeing now, I don't see it yet. Maybe it will happen, but so far it looks pretty good to me. I don't know. I have to say. I mean, I think problem is that a lot of us are, AI is kind of coming for the intelligentsia, so it feels threatening, and it is threatening. But it's threatening to people who have more rather than people who have less. So.
Okay, so I just wanted to mention something quickly, just to put some ideas on the table with regards to just exactly what the limits might be, of artificial, because that can affect what sort of tasks we might think we might use artificial intelligence to deploy to do certain things, whether it be automation or augmentation. And then of course, if you guys have something to say something. But then we can open it up to questions. And so I think it's worth noting that there are significant concerns with regards to the limits of artificial intelligence, and I'll be talking about generative artificial intelligence, which can sometimes get overlooked because it can often seem like it can do damn near anything. And that's because it keeps doing things that we don't expect it to be able to do. And there's a really bad track record that's almost funny of people saying, well, computers will never be able to do this, or artificial intelligence would never be able to do this. And computer scientists treat that as a challenge. Anytime somebody says that, they're like, okay, we're gonna go do it, right? And a lot of times, they can, right? But that's not a guarantee that will prove true of every task. Right. So some ways that I think about it, when I'm trying to get my head around what sort of things it can and can't do. So there are things, and I think this is the kind of stuff that we've been talking about largely. There are certain tasks that it's technically feasible to do, but there are serious concerns about doing it ethically. Right. And we've been talking some politically and economically, but I take some of the stuff that's under there as ethically. Right. And so it can be done. It's technically possible, it's being executed, it's being deployed, all that, but the results are ethically questionable or just straight up unethical, right? And we know all sorts of things about computers producing racist results and all these kinds of things, sexist results, these types of things. Now, there are some serious concerns about there just being some tasks that just aren't technically feasible. Right. So in philosophy, there are some serious concerns that we're raising about whether or not just the very structure of generative AI can actually deliberate. Because as was pointed out, I think you actually mentioned it, it's not responding to reasons in the way that we respond to reasons. It is effectively a next word predictor. Like, and that's what it's doing. Like, it's like predicting the next word on the basis of like a massive trove of past conversations, which is basically data scraped from the internet, right? And they are largely like induction models, like you were saying. Like, this is the way things have gone in the past, so this is the way things will go in the future. But that's not always the way that it works.
But maybe that's what we are too. Like,
well, I mean,
maybe, I don't know.
but that's like, that gets into philosophical questions. No, I mean, that gets into philosophical questions about the way rationality works, right?
Yeah.
And like, I'm a person who thinks that we're not, right?
But I don't either, but I just,
yeah. But it's like, it's not an unreasonable thing to suggest that perhaps, like some of us are, right? Or perhaps we are sometimes. But then the last thing I'll mention, which is like, I think it's like just an interesting thing because it might seem counterintuitive, is that there's the possibility of stuff that's technologically feasible to do that actually may become unfeasible once it's been done. Like, and I'll give you an example just because it's like very interesting, and that is that there's results that have been coming out like in the last couple of years that have actually shown that models that are trained on previous like data that their previous iterations have produced. So like AI generated like data that like say an earlier form of like ChatGPT has produced, once you start to train further models on that, they collapse, right? And so the phenomenon is called model collapse. And the problem is most people don't think that there's any way at this point to actually control the use of LLMs producing AI generated content online. Like it's just going to happen, and it's just going to keep happening. And then if that data is scraped from the internet and then used to train further models, we actually end up in this position where like human-generated data, human-generated content becomes an increasingly scarce commodity. Like, because there's no way to basically stop people from using it online, right? And so there's this concern that like unless something is done to actually continue to like find a way to have basically people producing content that can be turned into data for future models, like we can have trouble even training those models like in the future, right? But that's a result that people often find counterintuitive, right? But that's it. If you guys, do you have anything, or do you want?
Can I ask Laura a non-AI question before we talk about AI?
Yeah.
Okay, so
to me or to everybody?
Oh, well,
yeah, everybody.
She can answer first, and then other people can chime in. I wanted to ask you about the fissured workplace stuff, which I think is very interesting. And I wanted to ask how you think about, so on the one hand, like the story you told, very compelling, was about somebody's, like how people experience employment differently and how they're able to signal their skills and have career paths differently when they're an employee of the firm versus when they're a contractor. So that made a lot of sense to me. I want to ask about the other side of contracting, which is, and gig work, which is flexibility. And so how do you think about that trade-off where actually there's two sides of it. One is like I can make you a contractor, which means I can hire you and fire you. Well, the other hand, like if I'm laid off from a regular job, the existence of gig work and contract work allows me to move into employment much more easily. Like for example, when we think of it is on my Uber on the way over here, I was talking to my Uber driver who told me he got laid off 3 days ago and started driving Uber right away. Actually, he got laid off, he said because his employer knew he was about to go on paternity leave, and then I recommended that he sue. So that's a different story. But which he should, because that's illegal, the way he described it to me anyway. But the point is, he was talking about how they're expecting a baby, and he was so concerned, but he was able to start driving Uber and was just like driving until he could find a job, and like how he was able to basically bridge the gap in his monthly finances because he could go get a job right away. And so I don't know the answer, but it seems like a big advantage of allowing for more contract and gig work legally is that it allows people to bridge, to basically smooth over gaps in employment, whereas if other labor markets, like in Europe, for example, where that kind of work is more regulated, it's also more sclerotic. You couldn't just go get a job driving Uber 3 days after you got laid off. So how do you think about that trade-off?
Yeah, I mean, I think Isaac talked about this. I don't know if Isaac is still here, but I think Isaac talked about it even better than maybe I could now, which is that this is a trade-off that we've created as a society, right? Yeah. So I think your case illustrates it maybe even more sharply than a typical one, right? That guy shouldn't have been out of a job, right? And so it's solving for a problem that only exists because we don't think that employers owe their workers job security, right? And so in a place like France that has much stronger protections, right? Yes, it's harder to get a job, but once you have a job, you can rely on it over the long term much more easily, right? So what does that mean? I think on net, it's better for workers, although it does mean that there's stronger barriers between the haves and the have-nots, right? It is harder for people to access those good opportunities, but once you have them, you have more security, you have better benefits, you have a better employment situation more broadly. So, I think gig work is better than having a U.S. economy in which we have the current employment model and then no gig work, right? But I think a better option yet would be better labor protections, better employment conditions that made it so that gig work could be that fun enrichment thing that we were talking about in the last panel and not a survival strategy for people unfairly laid off.
So does that mean you think that European labor markets are healthier than U.S. labor markets?
For many reasons, I'm not an economist and I can't answer that question. And for many reasons, it's likely that they're not or they are at a given point in time. But what I do think is that overall, they are better for workers in terms of their employment conditions, right? Again, the haves and the have-nots, there's going to be a stronger balance.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree they're better for people who have the jobs. The question is like, I guess that was kind of, and there is no answer. It seems to me it's like a trade-off between workers and potential workers. Like there's some benefit to allowing people to flow in and out because then it's easy. Anyway, but it's interesting, very interesting.
I do think that there's a big question mark around whether it helps them get future jobs. I don't think employers value gig work as a signal of prior employment the same way they would if you had a normal job, a regular full-time job. And so as a bridge to formal employment, that's a question that maybe somebody studied that I don't know the answer to. How effective is it as a bridge to better employment? But certainly it helps fill a gap that we have in this country. So for the time being, I'm glad we have it rather than not.
I mean, just to be like in the example I gave, clearly this gentleman should have stayed employed, and clearly like that would have been harder to do. So in that case, it's clearly better for him to have been in a European model. The question is, like, if you look at, for example, what happened during the Great Recession, European labor markets really struggled precisely because it's so hard to get rid of people, and so therefore they just didn't hire for such a long time, and they couldn't readjust, and so the economy had a higher unemployment rate for longer because it was less flexible, so it's harder to respond to. Anyway, so always trade-offs. Anyway, we can keep talking about AI now. Sorry.
Right. No. Well, I want to open it up. So it'll be whatever questions anyone has. So if you have any questions, the mic's right over here, like on my right. And so please make your way up to it and ask whatever you'd like to ask.
While we're waiting for people to go to the mic, I have one more question for David and Brian, which is picking up on, David, where you left off with, people want that human relationship and that's not going to go away. So this is something I think about a lot, right? So during COVID, they filmed all the professors giving their courses. They recorded them. They now have the recordings of us delivering our courses. I don't have tenure. Why do they continue to employ me rather than just play the video of me delivering the course? And the reason is that for some reason, MBA students really value being in the classroom with the professor. They really value it. They're willing to pay, in my mind, an absurd amount of money for that privilege. But this is something that to me remains mysterious. What is it about that interaction that people value so much? And I think that, maybe, I don't know if you guys, this is a deep question, right? But it's just one that I think about a lot, and I'm really curious if you have any sort of intuitions about it. What is it about that human connection that people find, what is it that people find valuable about that human connection? Because I think that will also help us understand the direction we're going in, right? Where we need more jobs, or where we're going to continue to have jobs in this automated AI future.
Well, I mean, I think at least in my case, like as a teacher watching students and seeing what's going on, when they're pursuing their education in the way we expect them to pursue their education, I feel like I can adapt to their needs very quickly if they're right in front of me. Like if I can communicate with them, if they can ask me questions, if I can see what's going on in ways that it's not when I'm talking into a screen, but there's really no one there, right? And it's being replayed for them at some future time, right? And so and to the extent that that's valued, that seems to make a difference. I mean, I personally prefer doing it, right? I actually resisted recording stuff out of concern for making myself redundant, but also because I just like teaching.
Oh, yeah.
So.
I mean, I would turn it around a little bit to get some insight into it, which is why did I find teaching online such a horrible, disheartening experience, and why do I enjoy teaching in person so much? I think it's because learning is hard, okay? And if you're doing it well, it's hard. It's a struggle, and so part of what gets you through the struggle is the feeling that you're doing it together, and that you're building a relationship with somebody who's going to help you along that journey, and that you're going to look back on that struggle with some fondness, and look back on that relationship with some fondness. And you see that, and for me, the most depressing part of teaching a class online was always the very end, when I'd be done, and instead of everybody just coming up and milling around and talking at the end of the classroom, you just hit the end meeting button. It was the most depressing experience every week, and I hated it. And that's why, because there's some sense of camaraderie that's deeply human, that says we're going through this thing together to get to some outcome that kind of feels like painful at a time. And so you want to, as professors, we're not just deliverers of instructional content. We're mentors and guides and coaches. And as I've gotten older and taught more, I feel that's a more important part of the job than I had previously understood. And so even if you could watch a lecture online, that's a one-way relationship. You're not building a relationship with the professor. And so optimistically, I think we can use AI tools to do more of that, and less of the standing on a big stage delivering it to hundreds of people, which to me is no better than online. So that's my answer. And I think it's related to just the feelings of worth and of value, and really the most human things about us that I wouldn't want to automate even if I could. So.
There was supposed to be a whole line of people that walked up here while we were having that conversation.
No, and I find, maybe you were thinking this. The remark about learning being uncomfortable is, I find that something I have to actually reiterate a fair amount, and that's a thing that I think face to face it's easier for me to communicate, because when it's the situation where you're teaching through Zoom or something like this, I think I could be wrong about this. I think the perspective from the student is kind of this already sucks. Right? This is already uncomfortable. This is already unpleasant. And then now you're introducing me to ideas and thoughts and things like this that make me uncomfortable because I'm learning something. And so I just have a sucking scenario all together here. And I feel in class when I'm talking to people face to face, I can handle that. I can soften that. Right? I can help in certain types of ways where it's yeah, this is uncomfortable, but here's what you're getting out of it. Right? But.
Hi. Well, thank you all for this engaging chat. I'm hoping my question is a follow-up off of this interesting engagement we've had about kind of identifying what it is that we feel we would be losing if we fully automated or fully augmented our work, and then how do we maybe better identify that thing. So for context, I was thinking about in the types of work that you outlined previously, you're talking about the move, basically the norms against, or sanctions against using your flex hours versus not, based off of whether you're in the office versus not, et cetera. So I was thinking about how surveillance mechanisms have really taken essentially the space that social sanctioning did, such that it's not your peers who are side-eyeing you for leaving work early. It's quite literally that your company is paying attention to whether or not you're logged in and how often your mouse is moving. And so that to me responds to this idea that at the moment maybe employees are getting away, or having the benefit of having AI reduce the number of hours it takes them to do their tasks. But it's going to be, to my mind, a short amount of time before corporations are able, or employers are able to identify how often did you use AI, and how quickly did it allow you to do your work, and then now you're just going to exclusively do that. So my question is, what happens when surveillance mechanisms of that sort start infiltrating spaces that we think that AI won't be taking over because they have this sort of human quality to them? So for instance, OSU encourages folks to use Microsoft Copilot if they're using if they're using LLMs at all. But there will be a point at which, if you have a university device, they'll be able to tell how often you're using it. So what happens if there's a sudden demand for higher quotas of AI usage among folks who are doing these jobs that we were suggesting something will be lost if they rely on AI too much? This is basically just an invitation to say how, if our employers are surveilling us in our AI usage in pursuit of efficiency, what might be lost in the process of requiring folks to use AI more frequently or to augment their work with it, when there are aspects of their work that we're suggesting aren't going to be captured by AI usage and are actually made worse by AI usage if the surveillance mechanisms and accountability measures we have are exclusively based on whether or not you're using AI and being efficient in that way. Long story short, how do we say, hey, this stuff is worthwhile, can't you pay attention to whether or not I'm doing this work and not whether or not I'm using my AI, if we can't even explain what that thing is that's valuable?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I have an answer to where you ended up at the end, right? Except to say that there's plenty of cases that you can probably call to mind where whatever you're measuring, people are going to do more of, right? Basically affirming the importance of the question, right? So so if you look at monitoring, right? Forget AI for the moment. We'll bring it back in. If you look at the way employers currently use monitoring tools, they use things like how often are you online? How often are you using your mouse? But they also use metrics, right? How many emails did you send? Or how quickly did you turn a certain thing around? So this does a couple of things that might not be optimal, even from the employer's perspective. For one, it erodes trust with employees, right? If employees know they're being monitored, or if they suspect they're being monitored, which is often the case, they think they're being monitored, but they haven't actually been informed or haven't been informed in a way they understand. Maybe they just clicked a I accept button, right? That erodes trust, right? They end up spending time trying to game those systems, right? Trying to get around them, trying to avoid surveillance, and that can have negative consequences for the employer, right? The other distortion that you end up with is that people sort of over-index on what's being measured, right? They do more of whatever's being measured to the detriment of other things that employers might really want them to be doing, but can't measure effectively. Things like teamwork, things like mentorship, right? These things that are more amorphous, more interpersonal, harder to quantify. You end up with less of those because people are aware that they're being measured and their future opportunities are contingent on their ability to demonstrate performance on these particular metrics. And so you end up with a big problem there. So how do you then deal with that, right? So you're asking a really important question. How do you get organizations to value these other kinds of tasks, mentorship, for instance, in the educational context? There, I think, and this is sort of what I was asking David about earlier, this is really a bit of a power struggle between employers and workers, or between organizations and their members, right? And you're going to be able to make those demands to the extent that you have any sort of standing, right? So it's going to be easier in a tight labor market for employees to say, I want you to find ways of measuring and rewarding us for teamwork, right? Even though the employer doesn't necessarily want to do that. I think in part it'll have to do with that, and in part it'll be about finding common ground, right? The ability for us to say, you should value mentorship because of all these reasons. Let's find ways of making sure you're capturing and rewarding that activity. I guess that would be my preliminary thoughts.
I'll just add, I think there are some jobs where the output of the job and the things you're supposed to be doing on the job are widely agreed upon and roughly standardized. Right, so if you think about what's the difference between being a fast food worker, a short order cook, and a master chef. In some sense, their tasks are all prepare and serve food. They're all doing that, but they're doing it with different levels of autonomy, and that's kind of inherent in the job. And so if you think about a fast food job, it's kind of purposely designed to minimize discretion. And so that's the kind of job where where employers monitor, because the translation between tasks and output is very clear. But there are other jobs where actually you're being paid to be the expert, right? Where the employer says to you, I'm paying you because I don't know how to get to the right answer, and I'm relying on you to figure it out. So if you're a manager, like, what do you produce? What do you do? In some sense, the whole reason you're being compensated is because of your discretion. And so there it makes no sense to monitor performance, because the whole point is you monitor output. You might say, well, like, are you being an effective manager? But you're not going to tell them, if you could tell the manager what to do and how to supervise workers, you would just do it. So the whole thing is you're paying for the discretion. And so I think the former jobs, the jobs where you see more performance monitoring, it feels degrading and dehumanizing to be monitored. But I think most of those jobs are actually on the way station to at some point in the future being automated. And you see more and more work is the reason why you want to have a person in the loop at all is because people are better at adapting to unforeseen circumstances than machines and algorithms are still. And so you see more and more jobs having that like problem solver, expertise, management component to them. That's why managers are a large and growing share of employment and will continue to be, and even people who aren't managers have more of a decision-making aspect to their jobs. So I think that's really what's underlying it, which is what are the jobs that are surveilled and what are the jobs that aren't? The jobs that are surveilled are bad jobs. Like we would rather live in a world where there are fewer of those jobs and more of the other types of jobs, and there's some pain to getting there, but that's ultimately, I think, where we'll end up, is like a world where more of us have more control over our time and where we're actually being paid to exercise judgment.
Just a little anecdote on that. I've looked really hard for a case where an organization is automating managerial functions. And the only thing I could find was this one guy talking on the internet about how Tesla automated management decisions, things like budgeting. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. I'm going to talk to my students about this, automating managerial functions. And then I was like, I should probably find a second data point to help bolster this, not just this one guy talking on the internet. So I ended up reaching out to somebody who worked at Tesla quite high up for a very long time. And I was like, so what's the deal with automating managerial functions? And he was like, this is absolutely BS. We rely entirely on managers to make all of these decisions. We can't even fathom automating these things. So even a place that is as ruthlessly searching for efficiency as Tesla still needs its
But that's one way to
managers.
think about the future with AI is like we're all managers now. Like AI is your staff. And all you do is make decisions about what the AI should do. And the people who make better decisions about what to actually accomplish are going to be the ones who get the reward. So like we're moving toward a future where we're all managers.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. So I am formerly a high school teacher, and we used a system, I forget what, it's called iReady. I remember it was a math system that we used at the school. And it was very much like generative, like you answer questions, it tells you, kind of what your level is. It gives you more math questions that are related to that level and kind of builds, personalized for each student. And our students hated it. And it was just a flat out refusal to engage, right? Like I will sit on my Chromebook and do nothing and have the consequences for that rather than engage with this software. Like it was just a flat non-starter. Today I work as an academic advisor here on campus, and I advise undergraduate students. And they very much as well are not interested in any kind of like automation, with this service that we provide in advising. They want to work directly with an advisor. They want to sit down with me, talk about their goals, talk about their future, talk about, what they see themselves going and all of that. And that's what we do for our students. So I think that, in my line of work, there has never really been a point where using artificial intelligence has made sense for the type of work that I do. And despite that, I feel like in our current work climate, I'm always, hearing narratives and reading, literature and articles about how can we incorporate AI into your work, right? How can we get more AI into here? What should we be doing for you to be using AI? Even though I feel that in the context of the work that I do, that doesn't make sense, right? AI doesn't necessarily have a role that I can see, it makes sense to use it in this way or this way. And I'll go to a session at a conference for higher ed, and we'll talk about, maybe you could use AI to answer your emails for you sometimes. But 9 times out of 10, it's faster for me to just write the response myself and quickly send it out to a student. So I'm just wondering about this kind of push to utilize AI in workspaces where maybe it doesn't necessarily fit all that well, or it doesn't make a lot of sense to be using this day to day. How should we respond to this kind of continued push? Should we be looking for ways to incorporate artificial intelligence more into all types of work, or should we accept that, maybe some types of work are not as conducive to using this technology, or is there some kind of middle ground there?
So you're what I would describe as the front office of academic advising, which is you're the person who talks to the student, helps understand but there's a back office too, which is like, what data do you have about the student when they walk in? How much do you know about them? What kind of access to information do you have about what things might work for them and what might make sense? I do think there's some potential for AI to help with that. Whereas like, I don't know what you get, but you probably have some like reports that you get about students, and like you can see their grades, you can see what they've done, but you could imagine some product that uses the database of all other students who have been at Ohio State who look similar and tries to predict, well, how well would the student do in this particular course if I
Do
advised?
have that. It
Okay.
does not work.
Okay, well, how do you know it doesn't work?
Well, so what the software does
Yeah.
is it sorts students into low, medium, or high risk
Yeah.
by comparing their like traits to other students in the same category.
Yeah.
But it sorts everybody into high risk.
Okay, right. So that just seems like a bad model. But like,
No, it doesn't.
imagine that you could generate, and you could choose to use it or not. You could generate a prediction where, based on the student's characteristics, they have a 20% chance of getting an A, a 65% chance of getting a B, and a 15% chance of getting a C or worse or something. And you just shared that with them. Look, this is what and the front office role is not to say the algorithm told you this. It would say, look, based on all of the students that I've advised and that everybody else in this office have advised over the past 15 years, this tool tells us that these are the probabilities that you'll get grades in these courses, take it or leave it, and you explain to them and give them some context for what it means. That's, I think, a way that AI could be helpful without replacing, I agree, the front office. Like, you're right, students do want to talk to a person. But there's a lot of like, if you think about your job 30 years ago, it was much hard, the data wasn't digitized. So you were just flying blind. Does this student seem smart? Is like how somebody like you would try to give advice. And so now we're in a world where there's actually a lot of data on how students do, what levels of preparation in high school are associated with what grades. That's like, people don't think of that as AI, but it's really just like using data to make predictions for people that I think are helpful as long as you pair it with the human face. So, I don't know. But it sounds like the model you're using needs some updating.
That one doesn't work.
Somebody should fix that.
Thanks for your interesting talk. I wanted to go back to this conversation about the role of AI and sort of inequality and stratification. To me, I'll just kind of be honest, it seems like you're introducing AI in a moment when inequalities may have gone down a little bit. It's pretty significant historically. So I guess when I'm hearing this, and I know we talked about certain workers capturing AI to make their jobs a little bit easier, and it's likely that it'll improve the jobs of some workers. But if I'm playing this out in my mind, it seems like AI will be used by average workers in their workplace or outside of their workplace, like we use our phones for entertainment purposes and that sort of thing. And that corporations and elites will capture the technology to sort of further sort of enhance their own position vis-a-vis the workers. So, I guess it's a little dystopian, but I don't see, especially when you're introducing in a point, it's not like, I think about like the 1940s, 50s when 1 in 3 workers in the United States was unionized. That's not the case now. Workers don't have a lot of collective power. If we're introducing in that setting, I might be a little bit more optimistic, but we are introducing in a moment when worker power in the workplace has really eroded over time, and suddenly you have this new technology, and if I'm playing it, I don't know how, but if I'm playing it out, yeah, corporate elites will capture this to further their sort of agenda. Workers some of their tasks may be easier, but I think we're just going to see, just because it's a new technology that can introduce efficiencies, we're going to see that gap grow. Now, I'm not saying that average people, like you have a personal assistant now, we might see sort of small gains on sort of the worker end, but I think you're going to see bigger gains for corporate elites, people in those positions that are probably better situated to capture the full use of it. Whereas if I'm just using it to organize my day, and that helps me a little bit, whereas a company's thinking about this and playing it out, thinks about, okay, how do we maximize our profits? At Tesla, how do we organize work in a way that maximizes our profits, and probably not in a way that makes the average worker's life better?
Yeah, maybe this is more of a question for David, since I think I probably already am more anticipative.
So
yeah, there you go. That I could have guessed that. I think, to me, the technology doesn't do anything, right? The technology will enable whatever set of preferences are held by those who have the power to pursue their preferences, right? And so to me, it comes back to this question of, if you're thinking about who's going to get the gains, workers or employers, it comes back to, well, who has more power in that relationship? Which I think this is where I was sort of pushing earlier in the conversation, depends in part on things like how tight is the labor market, right? The reason we saw a decline in inequality post-COVID was, just pre to post-COVID was largely because of a tight labor market, right? So it's partly because of that, and it's partly because of the social policy that we put in place to bolster worker standing relative to employers, employment protections we put in place, things we put in place to support unionization or other forms of collective action. I mean, I think, personally, I tend to agree with you that if we just sort of let things play in our current regulatory landscape, which is favorable towards employers relative to workers, it is likely that employers will capture more of the gains. And maybe a new equilibrium will emerge where there's more kinds of businesses that absorb the unemployed workforce, and then there's new kinds of demand, right, down the line. But I don't think we can rely on this being good for workers, net of a policy environment that supports their ability to make claims on those gains. And so that's why I think it's, we can't predict exactly where this is going, but I do think we can start to think about what we can do as a society to make sure that our policy environment enables people who are disadvantaged right now to make more claims on those gains. That's my take, but
I mean, I agree with some of what you guys are saying. I just would add that if you want to take inequality seriously, I think you have to look at it globally, not just in the US. And I think a couple of important statistics to enter into this conversation. One is that generative AI usage is much higher in less developed countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, in India, and the Philippines. People who are non-native English speakers can participate in a global labor market in a much easier way because of the availability of this tool. And similarly, that was also true of technologies like computers and the internet, which even though they led to increasing inequality in the US, actually led to one of the biggest reductions in global inequality, actually the biggest reduction in global inequality in human history. So you've got countries like China, like the Philippines, like India, that were able to join the global middle class because of access to these technologies. And so from a global perspective, I don't think it's obvious at all that the technologies are increasing inequality. And I think that there is obviously people have different weights on citizens of their own country versus the globe, so I don't think that's an obvious debate about how that settles, but I do think that I don't think what you guys may end up being right, but I don't think it's a foregone conclusion. And what I see now with the way the technology is being deployed is a lot of it looks, at least from first principles, looks like it could provide opportunities to people who previously didn't have them. And I think that's worth taking seriously. Not every technology ends up increasing inequality. In the recent history, it has, but that hasn't always been true. So.
All right, so please join me in thanking Laura and David.